less tax. The Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, maintains that his big business tax cuts are still a priority. Do we need to give companies a tax cut? The government points to the surge in jobs last year as evidence that yes, we do. And do we need to get more people driving electric cars? Once again, an issue around climate and energy is causing real division inside the coalition, the federal government. I'd love to know what you think on 1300 222 774. It is your first polygraph for the year. You can put a question to former Minister, now humble backbencher, Darren Chester, the Nationals member for Gippsland, and Claire O'Neill, who is the ALP member for the seat of Hotham here in Melbourne, and also, of course, Shadow Minister for Justice. So if you want to put a question to either Labor or Liberal, 1300 222 774.
Okay, let's begin. I'm going to start by asking you a couple of test questions just to establish a baseline.
We'll start with an easy one.
Caught out.
Exposed as a lie in the media.
That's how you are calling him a liar.
Well, you can pick the name.
This was saying black is white.
Now go ahead and say something that is true so we can properly calibrate the machine.
The Polygraph.
1300 222 774. First polygraph of the year. Claire O'Neill, welcome.
Hi, Raf. How are you?
I am very well. Darren Chester, welcome.
Great to be back.
Do you look happy for someone who... Yeah, you went through this with John Fane, but you got demoted. You look remarkably happy and relaxed.
Oh, mate, I had a lovely January. I've been out on the road with my young son, travelling throughout regional Victoria and regional South Australia. Saw some great parts of our country that I probably wouldn't have had the chance to do if I was still a minister. So I've had a wonderful couple of weeks, and looking forward to getting back into the new year with a lot of vigour. Okay,
let's go straight to tax cuts, because clearly government's not backing off on that. Any number of people will say, listen, we don't need a company tax cut. The effective tax rate for companies is pretty low. Why is the government going down that path?
Well, we believe we have an economic plan which is taking Australia in the right direction, and we've seen the proof of that last year with 400,000 new jobs created. And I'd make the point that it's not governments that actually create jobs. Really, governments create the economic environment where businesses have the confidence to invest in their own products and to build for the future. And we believe it's important that businesses here in Australia are competitive with world markets. We're seeing reductions in tax rates, obviously, in the US, and we think it's critically important that we remain internationally competitive. And we think that we're heading in the right direction, and the plan, the enterprise tax plan put forward by the Treasurer, is one we're keen to pursue in this political year.
Doesn't look very popular, though, does it?
Well, it's pretty popular for the 400,000 Australians who got jobs last year. Sure. They're seeing good results.
Yes. Giving companies a tax cut? No.
Well, but our small and medium business tax cuts last year were very well received, and we think that we're heading in the right direction, and we'd encourage the Labor Party to get on board. If you're serious about jobs and creating new opportunities for Australians, we've got to make sure the businesses, which are the engine room of the economy, are competitive, and they've got the confidence to invest in their own businesses and grow into the future. And we believe we're heading in the right direction. We encourage Labor to get on board with us.
Get on board, Claire?
No, we are very opposed to this as the kind of central crux of the government's approach to the economy. Giving $65 billion away to the biggest companies in this country, we actually have really good data to tell us that's not going to have this great effect that Darren has pointed to.
They did get very good jobs growth last year.
But the tax cut wasn't in place, Raf. I mean, that makes no sense.
Second half of the year.
We had Treasury, so the government's own Treasury department, which, if anything, is going to overstate the impact of these cuts, do some really detailed modelling on what the impact is going to be. And that modelling really clearly shows that there will be very small impacts on growth, very small impacts on jobs.
Can I stop you there?
Yeah.
Governments don't have a lot of power. It might not be a big impact, but shouldn't governments try to do everything they can?
Well, I don't think giving away $65 billion is solving any problem that anyone's been able to point to. I mean, let me make the point. Our tax rates in Australia are very competitive, and the government keeps coming back to the 30% number, which is the headline rate. But remember, that's not what most Australian companies are paying. I think the big public policy question that we need to answer here is why on earth it is that somewhere between 3 to 4 of the big companies in this country out of every 10 big companies is paying no tax at all. Now, that is a scandal. That is a public policy problem, and it means that my constituents and Darren's constituents over here are having to foot the bill for health, for schools, for universities that companies should be chipping in for.
Look, 1300 222 774 is the number. Michael's called from Yarraville. I think you're on Claire's side on this, but what did you want to say, Michael?
Claire actually stole my thunder, Raf, completely. I've got to say, I think it's embarrassing what the the coalition are on about. It just doesn't make any sense. How many companies are actually paying nothing? Absolutely not. And I don't mind saying it's all good and well trying to talk about the United States, but the United States have a series of taxes, not just federal, they also got state taxes. I mean, that's never, ever spoken to. And that's the reality of it. No. Big companies are getting away with absolute blue murder. They're paying nothing. And we, the punter who are at the coalface, we're the ones who are actually footing the bill. As I say, bottom line, it's embarrassing.
Darren?
Well, if there are companies that are doing things to avoid tax, which is not within the Australian tax laws, obviously our efforts in terms of multinational tax avoidance and the crackdowns that the Treasury's already announced over the last couple of years are directed purely at that, making sure that companies do pay their fair share of tax. We simply
Do you reckon you could do more on that? I always get the impression that both sides talk about it quite big and act a little small.
Yeah, look, I think that's a fair comment to make, Raf, that the people who are interested in avoiding tax, whether it be at a personal level or at a business level, are driven by self-interest, and so it's up to governments through its various agencies to make sure that they're cracking down on anyone trying to avoid tax. So whether it's the black economy where people are paying cash to avoid paying their share of tax, or whether it's multinationals trying to avoid paying their share of tax, we've got to take it seriously. But the fundamental point that we're making with our enterprise tax plan is that reducing the tax burden on businesses, reducing the tax burden on middle-income Australians is good for the economy, and we believe that the Labor Party should get on board with that. Now, Labor has a view that taxes should be higher and should stay high.
Want to get on to electric cars? 1300 222 774 is the phone number. Ian is going to kick off on electric cars, talking about it because the Energy Minister, Josh Frydenberg's been pushing the electric car idea, not spending more, but already that's produced a bit of kickback from inside his own party room. Ian, what did you want to say?
Done a bit of back-of-the-envelope calculations. Your electric car ultimately emits probably about as much CO2 as my little 2002 Corolla. Because the energy that's generated to recharge that...
well, it depends where the electricity comes from, doesn't it?
It does, but most of our energy here in Victoria comes from coal-fired. Their efficiency overall is probably less than 30% once you factor in the transmission down to Melbourne.
There's a big CSIRO study that thinks they're good for the environment. Would you question that?
They're good for the environment long term. Absolutely, I agree. There's a lot of reasons to like them, and I do. The thing that Josh Frydenberg did was to sort of hide behind this thing of we're in support of electric cars.
Okay, look, I want to get on to, I guess, what governments should or shouldn't do. Darren, you're in the party room. You're a Nationals MP, the joint party room. Have I misrepresented what's going on there? I mean, the minister's been talking about it, and already people like Craig Kelly and I think Tim Wilson, the Liberal MP here in Victoria, are saying we are not spending an extra cent on electric cars. Is there a real division about it?
Well, it's a debate that we need to have, I think, as a nation. When you're talking about using taxpayers' money, we've just been talking about raising taxes, then we've got to talk about how we get value for money with taxpayer dollars. Would you use it to subsidise the production of electric vehicles? I would be inclined to say no.
Well, it'd be a tax break. That's one step down the path, isn't it? You give people a tax break. Second step is you stop people buying petrol vehicles.
Well, both of those approaches, I think, would be poor use of taxpayers' money. And I'm not because I'm against electric cars. I think electric cars are developing quite quickly. And they have, I think, a good role, perhaps more in a metropolitan environment than they do in a regional environment. In my electorate, it's nothing for me to drive 1,000 or 2,000 kilometres in a week. There's no electric vehicle that's going to fulfil my needs as a member of Parliament in a regional area at this stage. So I think they'll develop quite quickly, but they'll develop quickly if they're competitive and not propped up. So I don't think you need to prop up the technology. It'll develop quickly on its own accord. What it will do in terms of, I think, emissions regarding the air quality in the metropolitan environment, I see a real benefit for electric vehicles in that regard. But in terms of your emissions, in terms of carbon dioxide and creation of the vehicles and how the baseload energy is required to recharge them, it's a whole different equation. Becomes quite complex when you start going to that detail.
Claire, I'm going to see if I can get agreement from you. I'm going to get you chiming in agreement with Josh Frydenberg on energy policy. What he said, actually, I think yesterday, the day before, people who are now criticising electric cars in 10 years' time we'll be buying them. Do you think he's right?
I think he probably is right, but it's a pretty bizarre thing that's happened here. I mean, Josh basically wrote an opinion piece, a perfectly innocuous opinion piece. The central argument was electric vehicles are pretty exciting. And that was all it took to get every climate change denier in the coalition piling on top of him, telling him that, he's not to do a single thing about it. Some of these people who have come out swinging on a subsidy that's not even been proposed by Josh or anyone else are the same people who are advocating that the government should socialise coal exploitation in Australia. I mean, this is completely bizarre, the approach of these people, and it unfortunately shows one of the political realities for Malcolm Turnbull, which is that the Liberal Party and the Coalition cannot do anything about the climate problem in this country, and that is why 10 years after we really started this debate, we have emissions in this country going up and up. Right before Christmas, there was another report showing that our carbon emissions in Australia have increased. We are like a ship without a rudder here because the Coalition Party room is so divided on climate and nothing is going to move forward if the Energy Minister can't write an op-ed about something saying that electric vehicles are good.
Darren, is that right? Is that how your party room rolls? The joint party room?
Well, I don't know what party room Claire's been eavesdropping on, but it's not my experience in the party room. The comments I made about electric vehicles are simply that I think they have a future. They're developing quickly.
Can I clarify? I don't think Claire was in any way disputing what you said about electric cars. I
think we can agree we all love electric cars, right?
It's fair to say, though, isn't it, that the biggest disagreement in your party room is always around energy policy. That's fair, isn't it?
I think the biggest disagreement across the Australian political system right now is around energy policy, and the lack of certainty across the past decade has resulted in an investment strike in terms of baseload energy production here in Australia, and I think it's a critical issue we need to resolve. So, there's a lot of big issues facing the Australian Parliament. Energy policy is right up near the top of it.
We still don't have one.
The problem we've got is there's been inconsistency in that energy policy across the past decade, which has resulted in a lack of investment in new baseload energy supply here in Australia. And obviously, from my own perspective as a member who represents the Latrobe Valley, the real-world repercussion of that has seen things where closure of Hazel was a classic example, where jobs have been lost and there wasn't enough planning gone into how we're going to manage Australia's baseload energy into the future, to the extent where we actually installed diesel generators in the Latrobe Valley over the summer period in case we need them. I mean, that is a bizarre result for a nation that has such great resources in terms of energy production to be installing diesel generators.
I want to find out why the Federal Coalition is interested in crime in Melbourne as well. We'll get into that. More of your questions as well. 1300 222 774. Traffic check first with Simon Tackler. Hi, Simon.
Hi, Raf. In North Melbourne, a smash on Abbotsford Street at Arden Street, one in Epping, O'Hearns Road at Manor House Drive. In Fitzroy, tow trucks called out to Brunswick Street at Kerr Street. Also in Carlton, Victoria Street at Drummond Street. In Brunswick West, a serious smash where a car's rolled over, Dawson Street near Grantham Street. You will find closures set up in both directions there, so avoid the area if possible. On Kingsway, a car has broken down heading out just before you get onto Queen's Road. That's in the right-hand lane. The Monash Freeway slowing outbound from Toorak Road to Warrigal Road, then from Wellington Road to Clyde Road.
This summer, the ABC Listen app lets you listen to the ABC anywhere, anytime. With the ABC Listen app, you can keep up to date with the latest news bulletins, listen to live radio streams like RM, Triple J and ABC News Radio, and explore new worlds of information and entertainment. Hear the world differently with the ABC Listen app. Download for free today.
You're with Raf.
Sitting in the studio for the first polygraph of the year is Claire O'Neill. She is one of Bill Shorten's shadow ministers. She looks after justice. And Darren Chester was a minister, getting a lot of love on the text. Oh, I wouldn't normally vote. I would never vote national, but I don't reckon Darren Chester should have been given the.
Thanks,
I agree.
Thanks,
I
Mum.
agree.
Yeah, Mum's texting in. That's nice. The Coalition federally are very interested in crime as an issue in Melbourne. But first, Colin has called from Hallam. What do you want to say, Colin?
Oh, hi, guys. I'm involved in the electric vehicle charging area and recently did some studies. And I've got a big issue, and I'm saying I'm involved in the charging. I'm going to talk against electric vehicles, but just happens to be the industry I'm attached to. The tyranny of distance in Australia I see as a major problem for electric vehicles. we travel a lot further than a lot of other societies in big cities. And I think the reason
maybe
Australia...
the technology will get us around that. Maybe.
Oh, eventually we get around everything. But it's a 30-minute charge. That's a fast charge at a charge station. So where do you park your car for 30 minutes if you want to do a trip even to Geelong, let alone into...
But we might be able to... I mean, whether or not you're for or against them, you could have a major introduction in the cities. I mean, most people live in a city. They don't live... And most of us don't actually go that far.
My next thing was going to say that I believe we're going to be forced into it because the major car companies are now going to stop manufacturing diesel and petrol engine vehicles because the cities like London and Paris, etc., are banning those in the next only the next 10 years.
Yeah.
So
I think Paris is the end of next decade. Is that right?
I think that's right.
Something like that. Yeah.
Within 10 years, and London's about the same.
Yeah, look, I think we might be forced that way. But Claire O'Neill, I'll ask you this question at 22 minutes past 5. Peter Dutton, the Home Affairs Minister, says that the crime problem here, especially the youth crime and ethnic youth crime problem, is an issue that does not happen in places like Perth, Queensland, New South Wales. Do you think Melbourne's safe?
Generally, I do, and I think that's very well borne out by the statistics when you compare Melbourne to cities around the world. But I also don't shy away from the fact that there's clearly a crime problem here in Victoria. It's very important to note, Raf, that these are state issues. These are kids in Victoria. They're committing state crimes. They're being chased by state police and prosecuted by state officials. So I just invite your listeners to take a little bit of caution at the federal politicians who fly in, tell us how dangerous our city is, and then fly back out again. They're doing it for political purposes, and I think everyone can see through that. We know that police numbers is the best thing we can do to tackle crime, and your state government here in Victoria, our state government here in Victoria is, putting $2 billion into increasing police numbers, and that's the approach it needs to take, and it's having effect.
Took them a while, though, didn't it? Took them a while to turn that around. The crime rate went up and up and up. It's only in the last, I think, maybe last year the crime rate's come down, so it did take a while to get on top of it.
Well, I mean, that crime rate dip over that last year has been 6%. I think that's the biggest dip we've seen in Victoria for quite a number of years. So, I mean, Darren and I will comment on this very much as commentators. I can't do much about police numbers in Victoria, but I'll just note that, the state government is foot to the floor on this problem. They're very focused on it, and their actions are having impact. So I'm happy about that.
Darren, why are Peter Dutton and Malcolm Turnbull suddenly so interested in this?
Oh, look, I don't know, Raf, whether they're suddenly so interested in it. I think political leaders across the nation recognise that safety and security of the population is the number one responsibility, whether it's through border protection and the provisions we've put in place through Defence Force for keeping us safe as a nation, or whether it's law and order through the state police. It's a critical issue for all of us as members of Parliament.
Is there a racial aspect to it? Because there was about 100 kids riding outside the Torquay police station. No comment. There was big chaos that we spoke to the cops about down at Point Lonsdale. No comment. When there are kids of African heritage involved, that often prompts the federal commentary. Is there a racial component to this?
No, look, I'd hesitate to suggest there's a racial component to it, Raf. I think what troubles me, and I'm sorry if I sound so hesitant, what troubles me is this issue is just too big to be discussed as a media sensational item in 7 or 8 seconds, and it's going to take us weeks, months and years to sort out what's going on here. There's no question that the African youth are overrepresented in their crime statistics, but in the overall crime stats of Victoria, it's a very small number. But it's a disproportionate number of young African people are offending. And that tells me that there's a level of disengagement somewhere, that something's going on there where there isn't respect for the law, there isn't respect among some of those young people for the society they're living in. So they're disengaged in some way. But that's not just a problem for young African youth. We have young Islander youth. We have young Australian, everyday 4th or 5th generation Australian youth who are disengaged and offending. Indigenous youth. So youth crime is something that is deeply troubling, and it's not going to be resolved necessarily by political commentary. It's going to be community leaders working in close consultation with the education system, with the police, with the mums and dads, and then perhaps the politicians can put the broader parameters in place. And these are really difficult issues. I mean, when you see that level of disengagement, where you see violent crime, where people feel like they're so disassociated from that community, they can commit serious crime and it's no problem for them, that is an issue for us. And people are scared. There are generally people who are scared in some communities.
That the way you talk about it is not the way that the Home Affairs Minister and the Prime Minister talk about it. Would you like to see them change the way they speak about it?
Look, it's I used to be a cabinet minister, and one day I might want to be one again. So it's probably not the greatest.
You've got freedom as a backbencher.
Probably not the smartest thing in the world to be giving free advice
coalition prides itself
to the Prime Minister of Australia.
No, but
my view is very simply, Raf, that these are difficult issues. They're going to require more than 7 or 8 second news grabs. We're going to have to work our way through it. To pretend there's not a problem is really silly, because there is a problem.
Sure.
If people are feeling scared, whether it's just the perception of being scared, that's a problem. But when there is violent crime occurring and there are a group of young people of whatever descent thinking they can get away with it and thinking that that's okay, we need to back the police, we need to back the community leaders, and we need to give their mums and dads the support to actually get on top of this problem.
Do you want to say something briefly in response to
look,
that?
I just think, Darren has really, he's really touched on the complexity of this. And I think if I have any frustrations about the way this is being talked about by the leaders in your government, Darren, it is the oversimplification of it. And I think there are racial undertones to the way that they're describing this issue. I think you're right. There are some communities that are overrepresented in the crime stats. If you heard Malcolm Turnbull and Peter Dutton talk about this problem, you'd think it's only Sudanese young people who are committing crimes, and that's not the case. But they are overrepresented in those statistics, and some of those crimes are incredibly violent as well. So we can't just talk about, the backgrounds of these kids and say that the conduct is excusable. So I agree it's complicated, and I do wish that more coalition MPs were discussing this with the acknowledging those nuances.
Enough of the reason and the moderation.
Well, now that he's out of the cabinet, I can.
He was pretty reasonable. He was pretty reasonable as a minister. Most of them pretty reasonable most of the time. I might get shot down for saying that. Paul, you're in Blackburn. What did you want to say?
Hello. I read an article in the paper this morning. It was the Chief Commissioner of the Victorian Police, and he said, look, there's nothing the police can actually do about it, because all these kids are actually getting on social media. And
I think what he meant was there's not much the police can do about the social causes behind crime. I think he's quite keen to do things about those offending.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, exactly that. But also, too, he's saying because of social media, that people are actually getting on social media, and whether they're loosely bonded with each other or whether they're not even loosely bonded with each other, they just say, oh, look, we're going to do this, this is this, and it actually just happens because it's so instantaneous. They're not sitting around having a pizza and actually organising a crime.
Okay, look, it definitely makes it harder and makes it easier for those who look like they're going to offend to communicate, so thanks. I want to try and get your opinion on another issue that just goes around and around. It's like red meat for the media and politicians, the Safe Schools program. Reason being, the coalition here in Victoria have announced a bit of an education, I guess I'll call it a wish list, because it has no spending commitments. Tim Smith, the Shadow Education Minister, was chatting to John Fain this morning. To keep it simple, dropping Safe Schools because it's a distraction from the curriculum, winding back the focus on Indigenous history and sustainability, and putting forward a focus on American and British history before 1788, so I guess the history of our democratic institutions. What do you make of that, Claire?
Oh, to be frank, I just rolled my eyes when I saw that. I just wish this Matthew Guy fella would come up with some actual public policy that actually affects the lives of real people, instead of trying to search into the bottom of the barrel for dog whistle political things that he thinks people will vote for him because he can't think of any better ideas. I mean, this is just completely hopeless. So that's my attitude to the broad brush stuff. Safe schools. I mean, are we really sitting here again talking about the Safe Schools program? I reckon Darren and I will probably have a shared view on one thing about this issue, and that is that it's a primary role of members of parliament and governments to understand what the marginalised people in their communities need support with. And we know that young people who are having questions about their sexual and gender identity are much more likely to self-harm, much more likely to suffer from depression, and are 6 times more likely to attempt suicide than other young people. So schools came to government and said, please help us solve this problem. And that's where Safe Schools came from. It wasn't an ideologue sitting in some Green Left Weekly office who was dreaming up some way that they can, mess around with kids. This is a real problem affecting real people in schools, and it's a good policy, and I see it all over my electorate helping young people who would otherwise be in dire straits and really needing some support.
Darren Chester?
Well, it might not have started as that, Claire, but I think it's become such a politically driven agenda, the Safe Schools program, that there is some major need for overhaul, if not abandonment, of the actual program and replaced by an anti-bullying program which supports all students and doesn't focus on a political
Can
ideology.
I ask, Darren, just genuine question, do you say that because of something that you've actually seen in a school, or is it because of things that you've read about in the paper? Because I see a huge chasm between Safe Schools on the ground in my local schools and what I read about in right-wing columns.
Well, I think that's a very fair point, Claire. In my community, I'd suggest the agenda driven through the schools is less politically driven and more of a common sense direction and more about providing a safe environment for children to learn in. But if you get an ideologue in a school environment with the backing of a Safe Schools program, they can push an agenda which is creating great divisions within the school communities. And I think
do you think that happens?
I think it does happen. I think we've got to the point where it's been so badly tarnished as a brand, as an approach to this issue, that finding some middle ground would be the way to take this forward. And one of the things I would say is that it's so important that we don't outsource parenting to the teachers. I mean, parents have to have a very critical role in the education of their kids and the values of their kids, and working in partnership with the education system and the curriculum is a way to do that. Outsourcing it all to the teachers is becoming a very common habit at the moment, and I know from the teachers I talk to and the teachers' aides I talk to, they're getting a little bit tired of cleaning up every value issue or every welfare issue for students. I think our parents need to be making sure they're active contributors and working in partnership with the schools as much as they possibly can.
Thank you for coming along to the first polygraph. Appreciate it, both of you. Darren Chester is the Nationals member for Gippsland in the Federal Parliament. Claire O'Neill sits in the seat of Hotham for the ALP and is the Shadow Minister for Justice. Claire, thank you. Darren, thanks a lot.
Great to chat, guys.
Great to catch up with you.
And Happy New Year, if we're still allowed to say that.
I think we are. Until Australia Day, you're allowed to say that. Let's get some news headlines with Jim Graham. Hi, Jim.
G'day, Raf. There could be